Okay, good morning. Welcome to the Operations Committee. The date of the day is May 21st, 2019. We're going to get started in the first part of our Operation Committee. Let me open this up. We already opened at the top, I think. One second, my computer's, I don't need to wait for that. Okay, first for this morning is FY20 to 25 Capital Improvement Program, CIP, year in review and year forward. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I am Nicole Stewart, the Director of Facilities Planning and Real Estate.
And I'm Cindy Smith. I'm the Director of Facilities Design and Construction.
Thank you.
And today we will be presenting the FY20 through 2025 Capital Improvement Program Year in Review and Year Forward. So in today's presentation, we will provide an update on previously approved CIP projects. We'll talk about state capital funding for the year, the IEC recommendations for the FY20 CIP. We'll give an update on contingency funds, and then just a review of the decision points and timeline for CIP.
So briefly to go over our previously approved CIP project status. In FY19, we had 21 projects that were approved, and 12 of them are in construction or preparing for construction already. We still have 3 in design, and we did have to rescind 6, and we'll be talking about those actually in a later slide. For FY18, they're almost all in construction as well. There are 26 projects, including 11 that were partially funded with 2017. So 12 of those are in construction already, 4 are still in design. They had later funding approved so they don't have to meet the May deadline. And then we had 10 that were rescinded, and they were rescinded last year in conjunction with the 2017 projects because of the partial funding implications that happened there. Everything from previous years is in construction at this point or had been canceled already.
One comment real quick. I want to thank you for the way you presented this. Oh, I turned it off. I hit it on turned it off. I want to thank you for the way you presented your PowerPoint this time. I said because when I was reviewing it, I had lots of questions, and then when I got to slide 14 and looked at the questions that I had, they were answered at the end in the appendix. So, and I always ask you to please let me know with schools that and you did that, and it was a lot, and it was really good. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Okay.
So in regards to our 2 major projects, Holabird and Graceland are in construction. Those are our 2 net zero schools, the ones that were all of the energy that they'll use over the course of a year will be generated on site at both of those schools. So they're in construction. They're scheduled to be complete and occupied in just about a year from now, in August of 2020. So right now we actually have a scheduled construction completion date of the new buildings in July, giving us plenty of time to move in, and then we'll be demolishing the existing building and preparing the site, the field work that's right there. So they're going along smoothly, and actually the principal of Graceland told us that she's thrilled to be right next to one of them last night.
So, on to the capital funding review. So there are some important changes this year that are important for understanding capital funding for FY20. So at the beginning of the CIP process, it was estimated that the governor's budget for all LEAs would be $280 million. However, once we got to 90% funding, the governor made a decision to repurpose the remaining portion of his budget for other funds. So instead of $280 million being allocated to all the LEAs, only $252 was allocated to the LEAs, and that other $28 million which reduced the CIP statewide funding, went to enrollment growth and relocatable classrooms. So basically, school districts that are experiencing growth and have portables or relocatable classrooms. And so, since that $28 million was reallocated for or repurposed for other funds, Baltimore City's funding, where we were expected to receive about $29 million through the FY20 CIP, we received just the $26.5 million. And so this year, when they initially started the allocating funds, they actually projected out how much we would receive as a part of that $29 million. So as an example, if a project was $1 million and as a part of that first 75% funding, they indicated how much we would receive at the 75% funding and at the 90% funding and then at the 100%. But since we didn't receive that additional $2.8 million that we would have received at the 100% funding, that means that our CIP projects that have been approved, some of them were partially funded. In addition to that, just want to make clear that the governor also has $127 million in general funds that's potentially available for school construction. However, it hasn't yet been determined how those funds might be allocated. All right. And so I wanted to just outline the impact of that $2.8 million shortfall on our CIP projects that were funded. And so this first sheet details the major projects. So as Cindy just outlined, Hollibird and Graceland are currently in construction. And as a part of our request, we requested the full funding for these projects. For FY20 because major projects are funded over time. However, what we received was not the full funding because of the reduction in the $2.8 million. So we still have about $1.3 million that we need to fund for the major projects that are in construction. In terms of Armistead Gardens this year, the IEC did not, even though we requested $1 million, they did not fund Armistead Gardens. And then Marie G. Faring, we requested $4 million. However, they only ever indicated that they would allocate 1.5. And so we did receive those funds for Marie G. Faring. So the systemic projects. So here we've just outlined a summary of systemic project by types and similarly looking at the impact of the $2.8 million shortfall. So for AC projects, we needed about an additional $1 million to cover what we requested for FY20. I'll address fire alarm and safety in a second. So pools, we similarly needed an additional $285,000, and windows and doors, about $145,000, leading up to $1.5 million in total. So for fire alarm and safety projects, the IEC, in continued conversations with them, they have decided not to fully fund our requests for fire alarm and sprinklers. So the funds that we were authorized, the 1.25 we were granted for or allocated for those projects does not reflect the full funding for those projects because they only funded the portion that were fire alarms and not the sprinklers.
Can you go into that a little bit more? So this has been a long-standing conversation with the IEC, and the IEC doesn't feel like sprinklers are needed in our schools. Is that?
That's correct. Yes. So technically by code, the sprinklers are not required. And so they're going on that and saying that since the code does not require that we put sprinklers in the existing buildings, that they aren't going to fund them. We've requested sprinklers because that makes for a safer building, both from life safety and property value perspective. And the fire marshal has indicated in the past that they would like us to have the sprinklers.
And the code requires sprinklers to be put in any new buildings.
New buildings.
So our rationale was that when you're updating a building,
Yes.
you're replacing a system, that you should replace it with what meets the
put the
code
new code.
requirement, which would be sprinklers to ensure student safety.
Correct.
But that's not the IEC's take on it.
Yes.
How do we get them to change the dynamic, considering the fact that the building's relatively new? I mean, we want to be proactive instead of reactive. So how do you change the dynamic in terms of conversation? So they can say, this is a repurpose, this is a virtually new building, let's go to the new standards. How do we do that?
I mean, we've tried a number of things in the past with other issues with regard to the IEC. There's been a longstanding conversation with the operations team and the IEC on this issue. In the past, on other issues, I don't know if we've done on this one, we've sometimes brought in state legislators. We've either written letters or brought in state legislators to help. Sometimes that help advocate for a particular position. Sometimes that helps. Sometimes it doesn't. I mean, we can certainly try it on this too. We often are at odds with the recommendations, and so we do push back in a number of different ways. Unfortunately, we are completely beholden to the state in terms of the way we receive the money and the kinds of improvements we're allowed to make in our buildings. In other jurisdictions, they have the money themselves, so they can do it themselves.
So then the shortfall for the fire alarm and safety projects, technically it's $78,000, but that does not include the additional $2.7 million that would have fully funded the projects to include sprinklers.
Yes, another question I have is, okay, you start with what you request.
Yes.
Then you go through it and you say, this is what I think they'll give us, or I hope they give us, basically in the second column.
So that was what they indicated to us that they.
Oh, that was the early
fund.
indication.
Yes.
That wasn't a hope.
Right.
But then they changed their mind and gave you less.
Right, because
Okay.
they repurposed that $28 million, which resulted in $2.8 million shortfall for city schools.
Is it always economics, or is it some other thing that goes into the decision to give you less money?
So for this particular year, it's sort of two different things happening at the same time. One is them projecting out what the 100% funding is going to be. So that hadn't been the case in previous years. They just started that last year, actually. And then it is also the governor had a number of different priorities for this year that he had proposed but weren't funded. And so I believe that is what impacted the change in what he anticipated allocating directly for the FY20 CIP, as opposed to other funds that would be allocated to LEAs for different types of projects.
And the amount that was reduced from the CIP allocation this year was for, I forget, it's for the expanding districts with expanding population.
Yes, the enrollment growth and relocatable classrooms.
Right. So this has been a pot of money that's existed for the last few years, but it's growing, and it goes to districts, primarily some of the wealthier jurisdictions who have population increases, to remove students from portables and put them into newer buildings. And so it's been reducing. This is a concrete example of where it's reduced the amount of money that's allocated to us.
So as a result of that $2.8 million shortfall, we ended up using what was in our reserve contingency fund to fund those projects. And we'll have more about the reserve contingency pot of money later in the presentation. So here we have been, over the past few years, sort of mapping our facility investments in different buildings against our community conditions index, which is an index that we use to sort of categorize the different neighborhoods across Baltimore City based on a number of different factors, including sort of things related to poverty and median income and availability of healthy foods and home ownership and those kinds of indicators about communities in Baltimore. And so we looked at the projects that were funded in the FY20 CIP, and as you can see, a majority of them are in what we call low investment communities in Baltimore City. And then there was a question, I believe, about the overall funding of CIP over the last few years. So what we did have handy was an analysis that we did a few years ago where we looked at the past 10 years. And so while 40% of the FY20 projects were in low investment areas, 36% of the completed CIP projects between 2007 and 2016 were also in that Community Condition Index category, and it is really just directly comparable. The only, in terms of the distribution of projects across the city in different types of communities, the only sort of shift would be, as an example, the higher investment communities in Baltimore received about 27% of the, which are the darker green areas, received 27% of the FY20 projects, but then about 17% of the CIP projects over the past 10 years.
So shifting to some additional funding that we did receive this year in addition to the CIP, there is the school safety grants allocated by the Maryland Safe to Learn Act. We did receive $1.07 million of the 10.6 that was allocated in FY19. We have 27 projects identified through that grant that are currently primarily consisting of door hardware and CCTV, so security cameras. There is a list in the appendix of all of the projects that are being completed through that one. In addition, we have the Healthy School Facility Fund grants. Senate Bill 611 introduced to provide some additional funding. It's supposed to provide $30 million annually with not more than 15 to any one district. These funds have not been allocated yet. We are still waiting for the guidance as to what kinds of projects. It's supposed to go to projects that need air conditioning, heating, et cetera, but we don't have the guidance yet from the state as far as how to submit projects for this, et cetera. So as soon as we have that, we'll be able to identify those projects and then submit them for approval. In regards to the air conditioning plan, this is kind of a graphic that shows the breakdown. We have the actual text breakdown on the following page in regards to how many different projects we have over the plan year, how much money each year is allocated, and how many projects, and that includes 21st century. So it's basically all the ways that we're putting air conditioning in buildings. For this year, we have, for school year 1920, we have 20 projects in progress. You got 5 projects that are 21st century, 4 are still in design, 6 are going into construction right now. They've all now been approved with contracts. There are 3 already in construction, and we have rescinded some additional projects. So these are the projects that we talked about previously over the 6 that we rescinded from the CIP. We rescinded 4 projects here because of funding, and 2 were rescinded because we didn't need them anymore. Gilmore was one of those. With closing that building, we didn't need to put air conditioning in it. And then Brems Lane, we actually determined different ways to do some air conditioning there rather than doing this, basically including the repairs to the existing system that will make it functional. We actually did one additional one that we're going to then be completing through the 15 million HVAC fund, so a different funding source instead. So 4 will be resubmitted in a later CIP. Yes.
If we go back a couple slides to the school safety 1.07 million, I'm wondering if we ever, and this is probably more expensive, but have you ever looked into smart doors that would allow principals a little more control over the doors that are on the sides of their buildings? A lot of times students will prop doors open and therefore people can just walk in, but a propped door would provide a signal to the main office. And I don't know if you've looked into that. It's probably more expensive, more money than we have, but might be a nice solution to some of what some of the students are doing.
So I know in the past we have looked at them, and they have become a real maintenance problem with that connection of that electronic system to the main office, in that it gets short-circuited, it can't be, it basically circuits out, and then then there isn't any control over it. And we've invested that money into the door that then no longer works that way anyway. But I don't know if you have anything further.
And just to go along with what Cindy's saying, so we've had there was a conversation that was had with principals, and they were asking for maybe security cameras for their side doors as a alternative. But like as Cindy said, we did investigate.
We had actually installed them in at least one building in the past, and they did not. They ended up being the ones that just hadn't stopped working. We ended up disconnecting because we couldn't keep them up.
I thought as part of our conversations about the security plan that we also talked about, maybe this is the same thing, but the doors with the bars that sound an alarm if you open them, with the alarm will sound if you press this bar. I thought we talked about that as a possible solution for this problem.
Right, and so that's also it's still a cost impact too.
But I meant in a future round, that we talked about that in a future round. I'm trying to understand for my own edification whether that has the same problem that Cindy's talking about in terms of electronic connection, or whether that's a simpler version.
It's usually a simpler version. We can take a look at that one. I think that's, for
So I
further
think
on.
that's
It is more expensive, so yes.
Yes, I think that's one thing we talked about for future rounds of exploring.
And it becomes a capital project. So it wouldn't be security, it would be on a CIP side as a capital project because it's a doors project. Because you would also have to replace some of the doors too.
Yes.
You mean you couldn't use this you couldn't use the security funds?
Well, because the 1 million is not going to go very far when you have a large numbers of schools, and then also because you would have to be replacing the doors. Each door is a significant cost. So we explored it, and it was a conversation of that it would have to be a capital expense. It would have to be in the CIP.
Or perhaps think about starting with our high schools, and then as we get more funding, work our way down. But I think that would be the priority for me.
Well, I guess dovetailing what Jeanette said, so in terms of efficacy, the easiest way for you to do this now is cameras. How is that working in terms of, it seems like cameras would be after the fact, but.
So this is just a part of our discussions with principals. It's talking about as an immediate impact. Because, as I said before, a lot of it is a cost constraint. So I would say that for one of our doors project, it's almost $1 million, and that's the whole fund. So if we say that, let's say we target high schools on the front end, that's a whole round. So if we receive Baltimore City is receiving about $1 million of a high school doors project, in order to do it for all the doors in a high school, it's going to be close to $1 million. It's basically the whole round of funding. And so what we've been doing is that in the interim, because we're not getting a significant amount of security dollars, and because we'd have to wait for a capital project, what is something that we can do to provide some kind of safety and security right now in the interim while we explore some of these other project opportunities?
I would just say that cameras are only as good as the person who's watching them.
Yes.
So we need to make sure we have some sort of plan with our principals that is someone's job. Otherwise, if a doors project is $1 million, how often do we get these safety grants? Let's just make a commitment to keep kids safe, so that stories like, what happened at Douglas doesn't, continue to happen, is all I'm saying.
Yeah. Well, I just will remind you that as part of the legislation, we're currently doing a review of safety at all the schools, and so that will help us prioritize. The team has been very thoughtful about thinking about how to prioritize the very limited resources we have. But I have to agree with you on the cameras. Because also a lot of times the door propping is not like the door is like wide open. It's like there's a pencil or like an eraser in there. I wouldn't even see it. Even if somebody was watching the camera, they wouldn't necessarily see it. So. Cameras break too. So part of our challenge is the maintenance. We have to take very seriously the maintenance of all these systems, because you can take the money up front to put these systems in place, but then when we don't have resources to maintain cameras in every school, or those bars in every school, those bar kind of doors in every school, then that becomes a challenge.
How many high schools do we have?
36 schools that serve high school grades.
I guess the reason I ask that is it costs $20,000 probably for a person to watch the camera. multiply that by this number of schools you have. In 2 years, you pay for that, having a smart system.
I visited Edmondson High School. Have you seen that system that Mr. Perry have at Edmondson? He sits at his desk, and he has a screen that can look at all the doors around the school at both sites, on, his west side
Nice.
and the original, traditional school. I say traditional, original, west side. And he looks at it, and he has it right at his desk. Is that something that we would be looking at, or is that antiquated? I don't know. Or is it old?
So the CCTVs are typically, they're all digital these days, so you can pull up most of the time the cameras on pretty much any kind of device, whether it's the principal's screen or the school police or, even sometimes your phone, depending on the system that's being installed. I honestly am not familiar with the exact system that is going in with these. They've been going through operations,
Right.
but
You should go
pretty
look
much be
at it,
able to.
because he has a big
Yes.
screen, and on his screen, he has the
Yeah,
cameras.
should be
He can
able
look
to
at
from
it
everywhere.
all
Yep,
over
every
the
one of
place, and he can look at whatever part of the buildings. You haven't seen that?
I haven't been to
Have you
his particular one, but I've seen that in other
Okay.
places, so yes. Yeah.
He's a principal.
Why should he be doing
Exactly. That.
Yeah.
Well, because they don't have the
that's-
money to pay somebody, right?
He's a principal. He should
And
be
so he's
drafting
walking the
his own-
building,
Right.
he's checking on classes, so
Right.
that's probably rarely being
Yeah.
observed. as
Well,
much
it
as-
saves him from walking around to both sites, Edmondson West Side. It
No,
saves him.
what I'm saying is, as his role as principal,
Right.
he's got way
Way
more
more to do,
Yeah,
right.
That's all we're saying.
It's a lot of work, right? Okay, thank you.
Okay, so, the rescinded projects. We had to rescind 4 of the air conditioning projects for funding, and that was primarily because for our FY18 and 19 projects, the AC project bids came in higher than our original estimates. This is the first time we had done these kinds of projects. This is the first time anybody in the state had done these kinds of projects. So we had been taking best guesses when we put in the estimates. When the bids came in, we had real numbers. So to move as many of the FY19 projects forward as we could and not basically cancel everything because of funding, we canceled as few as possible to get the funds to then we put forward into those other ones to move them forward. So we moved forward the 12 that we did by rescinding some of the ones that we did. So the ones we rescinded will be put into a later CIP, and then we got to move, several of them forward then instead. Then we also we've been tracking those costs, and when we submitted the FY20 CIP, we submitted it with the higher estimates, so those should be coming in, and we've already seeing the prices stabilizing at that, so they should be coming in where we've got the estimates at, so we shouldn't have that problem in the future. We have drafted communications, and I believe they were going out today to the principals, both of the ones then that have been approved for them to go forward, as well as the ones that had to be postponed to alert them.
And because there's been a lot of attention on these projects, the air conditioning projects, we also did an update in like January or so
Yes.
on the air conditioning plan to inform the IAC, the governor, the comptroller of the changes in the plan. And we had that reviewed by our Operations Advisory Committee, which includes outside experts in construction, helped review the plan that we're putting forward now in terms of how we're going forward with these projects. And the benefits of the approach that the team identified in terms of these vertical package units, which are more energy efficient, have longer lifespan, provide heating. But they have slightly higher costs, and the real issue is that the electrical load needed for anything you input into a classroom heating or cooling solution, the electrical load upgrade that you need is significant. So that's the main cost driver, and so we have already informed people of that change, and then the team was really proactive in trying to figure out how they could rescind the minimal number of projects to continue the maximum number of projects moving as much as we could.
Yes.
But the increased cost will mean that these air conditioning will take longer than we had originally said, because
Yes.
it's a significant increase in the cost.
We are also updating our website with, every time we make a change to the plan, we update our website on them so that the public is aware of any of the changes to the plan. Now, the reserve contingency funds. So what happens when we rescind a project, it goes into what is called a reserve contingency fund. And then we can use those funds for other CIP projects that have been already reviewed and would be approved if it wasn't for funding by the state. So those AC projects that we rescinded amounted to about $3.5 million, and they all got turned around at the same time that they were rescinded, turned around and put right back into the AC plan and those other projects that we were able to move forward. We rescind projects because of, bid results, partial funding, contract issues, things like that that are typically out of our control that we can't fund further. We will also be we will also be using our reserve contingency funds then to fund that $2.8 million shortfall in our FY20 CIP so that we can move our FY20 projects forward, because otherwise we wouldn't have the funds to be able to move any of our FY20 projects forward. And finally, we have the HVAC funds. These are additional funding also that were separate from the CIP. We received the $15 million for HVAC projects. All of the funds have been awarded through December, January, and February to specific projects that were identified. We have 21 projects that were identified and approved for a total cost for construction of $13.7 million. This one was rare in that we were allowed to use the funds for the design as well. So when you include the design in there, I think we've requested $14.9 million of it, with then if something comes in over bid, there's $100,000 left, but that's about it. They had to be used for HVAC equipment, and so that's what all of the projects are done. And there is a list of projects in the appendix of what those 21 projects are.
This is the one, some of the information's in the appendix, right?
Yes.
Great. And so at this point, the final 100% allocation has been approved by the Interagency Commission on School Construction. And just as a summary to recall where we are, we received about $26 million for FY20. We had a shortfall of about $2.8 million, where we were supposed to receive $29 million. So that is our allocation for FY20, and then there still remains $127 million from the available in the governor's budget, and we're waiting on information and guidance about how that money might be allocated to LEAs and for what purposes. There was a question about how we prioritize CIP projects. I believe I received that additional question, so we're adding that information to the appendix, but just to give you a brief summary of that, we first do a qualification review. So as an example, we are not allowed to request CIP projects for buildings that have below a 60% utilization. So that's sort of the first step. And then we first start with this initial review by our maintenance team for them to identify any sort of emergent needs. My microphone was not on. So I'm just reviewing the prioritization process for CIPs. And so as I just mentioned, we start with just doing a qualification review of the buildings that are eligible to receive CIP funding. We then do our maintenance team does an initial review to identify any emergent needs. It's important to remember that since we receive our allocation from the state is so small that many of the projects that we even start in the recommendation process do not reflect all of the projects that are needed. Then we move on to a quantitative rating system that we developed about 4 years ago, where we look at sort of the financial impact and implications. So that means, are there cost savings from multi-systemic projects? Is the project previously rescinded? Is it partially funded? Those kinds of things. And then we look at alignment with other facility plans. And so we're looking at the comprehensive maintenance plan. We're looking at sort of the additional funding for other purposes that might become available from the state. We're also looking at sort of academic plans. And so part of the consideration is what changes might be made to the portfolio over time so that we are not allocating or suggesting projects in buildings that we may not want to keep. In addition, we're looking at the asset condition. So that's the life cycle of the different systems in the building, what's the level of deficiency, and is the project essential to life safety? And lastly, I'm looking at academic impact. So what is the educational environment or level of service? And so just looking at what the improvement might be in terms of
Does
academic impact.
the decision-making happen in that order?
So it is,
Because
no.
it's like academics was last. It made me think the question.
So it's not academics in terms of academics. It's more so, does a building have an elevator or not? And is that impeding students' access to get to classrooms? Not academics, right? And so we look at all these things as a whole. Each item that we mentioned does get a certain set of points associated with them. So as I mentioned, we came up with that rating and ranking system about 4 years ago. And so we use that to give sort of an idea of where a project lands. But then after that quantitative review, we still go back and look, okay, does this make sense in terms of what's happening across the district and what the needs are?
One.
Okay, Commissioner.
Your contingency funding, how do you develop that? Use it?
Do you mean the reserve?
Because you say you need 280 million from the state.
Mm-hmm.
The state's going to give you 252.
Well, not
You
us.
have-
Sorry, not to interrupt, but no, that's for the, that's overall what the governor identifies as what he would give every LEA across the
Okay,
state.
okay.
Mhm.
Okay, you have a shortfall of 28 for something.
2.8.
2.8.
Yes.
Okay, that shortfall for 2.8, you said you're going to cover it out of contingency fund.
Mm-hmm.
How did you get to that contingency fund? And is that based on a percentage of something?
No, so the
Reserve funds you've had accumulated over time? Where'd that number come from?
So the reserve contingency funds accumulate from a variety of sources. So if a project, let's just say that it was approved at $400,000 and the bids came in at $380,000, that $20,000 goes into the reserve contingency fund. So anytime we have it as higher, when a project is closed out, that happens. If we have to cancel a project or rescind a project because of a funding issue or a contractual issue, because we funded through another source. For example, Windsor Hills in the AC plan, we're actually funding through the $15 million HVAC plan, because it was just only a wing. So there are decisions that were made there, and so we're taking that money and it goes into the reserve contingency funds from the AC for that one. So the funding builds up in that through a variety of sources. We try not to let it build up. Because if we do, then there is a tendency to recycle that into our CIP funds in future years. So once there is money in there to do another project, we typically choose to then put it towards a project that has been reviewed and would have been funded if there had been funds available from the state. So once they get to the 29 million, for example, they have reviewed the additional 20 other projects we submitted. There just wasn't funds that they could give to those. So those would all be eligible, so we could then use our reserve contingency for that. In this case, because we need the 2.8 for our shortfall in the FY money, we're using, instead of being able to choose another project, we're choosing all of our FY20 projects to be able to move them forward instead of something that may have been from FY19 that we could have done instead.
So it's like pay as you go.
Pretty much.
Okay, so it's not like you create this contingency fund at the beginning of the year.
No,
It's
it's not
based
something
on-
that we put money in and hold it there.
Based on
It's-
cash flows.
Yes,
Okay, thank you. And you know what? At the public meeting, you would not have to address this again, but when I present for the operations, since that was one of my questions in the beginning, and you answered them in the appendix, but you have to keep on looking, and then you see where it's located. So I might just mention that after reviewing what you presented, we were able to understand where the additional money went and how it got there. So, because it is a question, because when you start looking at your presentation, you have a lot of questions, and you say, well, go down to the appendix and see if it's there. And thank you again for presenting it, because that was my big question, as usual. So, okay, thank you.
So we can include for the copy that is on board docs, just a note in some of the earlier slides that the detailed information is in the appendix.
Okay, thanks a lot. Okay, next, 2019 Comprehensive Educational Facilities Master Plan, CEFMP, please. Thank you.
Right. So good morning. My name is Nicole Stewart. I'm the Director of Facilities Planning and Real Estate here at City Schools, and today I will be presenting our 2019 Comprehensive Educational Facility Master Plan, or the CEFMP. So as required by the Interagency Commission on School Construction, City Schools is required to submit a CEFMP every year. The CEFMP is the primary tool to communicate how facility goals and guidelines align with academic goals. The document is also primarily a repository of information about our facilities, as well as context about the neighborhoods where our students reside and where our schools are located. So what's new for the 29 CEFMP? So every year we are required to look at enrollment trends, births, enrollment. We also produce the 10-year enrollment projections, and then we also look at some of the housing indicators across the city, providing that context about what's happening in neighborhoods. This year, in addition, we are also, since we now have 9 21st century schools that are open, we are doing some basic 21st century profiles about sort of things related to facilities. So where the students are coming from, what the utilization has been at the schools that we've opened, how students have moved in and out of 21st century buildings through the entire process, and now that they're in their new buildings, what does that enrollment look like? In addition, we are continuing to expand sort of data visualization and story maps just to tell the story about what's happening across the district. And I just want to note that the CEFMP is a major undertaking for the Facilities Planning Department. There's a lot of coordination across different departments, a lot of data analysis. So I wanted to take this time to introduce my team. So we have Maureen Gershberg, Greta Sawyers, and then we have our intern, Solomon Gibson Alvarez, who will be with us over the summer. He is from Baltimore, and he's currently attending Howard University. Yes.
And a graduate of City College.
Yes.
Wonderful. Welcome. Welcome.
All right, so as a result of some of the recent conversations that have been happening around enrollment, we wanted to dig in a little bit deeper on sort of the relationship between enrollment and other factors that contribute to some of our enrollment trends, and just to outline some of those things a little bit more explicitly. Every year we look at this data, but this year we put together the data in a way to sort of better explain what the relationship is between enrollment and some of these factors. Right. So in school year 18-19, we understand that we are at the point that we've experienced the 4th consecutive year in enrollment decline since our peak in school year 14-15. And we've lost about 1,300 students every year since that peak. And as I mentioned, we'll delve a little bit into how the other factors that we may not always consider, some of the demographic and housing factors are contributing to the enrollment in city schools. So to understand that relationship, we start by looking at 4 indicators: the number of births, the birth rates, or the number of live births per 1,000 population. Then we look at kindergarten enrollment 6 years later. So those individuals, children who were born in 1 year, who will be entering into kindergarten 6 years later. Then we also look at capture rates, which represent the number of births divided by K enrollment 6 years later. So when we look at these factors together, not all of them are moving in the same direction every year, and they're also not moving at the same magnitude. But what starts to emerge when you look at these numbers over time is 2 distinct time periods. And so I just want to spend a little time talking about what's happening in those time periods. So during the Great Recession, which lasted between December 2007 and June 2009, across the country, nationally, birth rates were at their highest level in over 2 decades. In fact, in year 2007, that was the highest birth rate in the country ever recorded. And so those trends are mirrored in Baltimore City. So you can see, and I'm having a bit of a problem seeing the screen, so I just need to refer to my sheet. So in 2006, 2007, 2008, which correspond to school year 11-12, 12-13, and 13-14, we can see those increased birth rates, the high capture rates. And just to give an example or just some emphasis on how much of an anomaly these years were, this was the highest capture rate in the 40 years of data that I observed. So that means that these are just really significantly different than any other years in Baltimore City history in terms of the births and how many of the children born in a year who then enroll in kindergarten at city schools.
You mean the ones that, because I've got the 2 different, you're on slide 6. The highest rates are the ones from SY 15, 16, and 17.
Right. So as I said, some of the data points don't exactly align every year, but you can see that trend where those are the highest, but you can see the increasing trend from SY 10, it was at 70%. And then you can see that increase to 72 and 74 during that time period before and during the recession. And yes, the capture rates are higher in that later time period, but I think it's just really about the flow of students and considering how these are January to December births, but not necessarily September to August births. So I think that contributes to it as well. And I think it's more about the general trend of things and not everything happening at the same time in a particular year.
Do you have a specific question?
I don't. That means I'm really lost because I don't even know what question to ask.
Uh-oh.
Continue, Nicole. It's okay. It's
Okay.
I guess it was the months, why the months in the year when the bursts, the data for the bursts, why the time frame throughout the year that you're referring to, why that would impact the correlation. I think it's just like a delayed impact. It's like more like a
think so.
5.5 years or something as opposed to 5 years.
Right. I think that's impacting it. And like I said, these things are independently, if you can look at them independently, but when you look at them all together, they sort of tell the story, but they are sort of outliers in particular years. I'll just point out school year 11 and school year 18. I consider them sort of bookmarks on this really strange time period where we had extreme increases and extreme decreases. Right. And so all the way the numbers are moving are completely different in those years.
You're saying kind of a more normal capture rate is 70%?
So our average over time has been about 72%. So once we start to see that increase of 74% during that time period, that has just been unusual. And then the 77% 7% is just the highest. That whole range of when you get over 72% is just abnormal.
So can I ask a question about, and you participated in the enrollment task force work. So as we move to implement some of those like early recruitment activities, right, reaching out to families earlier with 1 and 2 year olds, will you, in terms of the data, once that work formally rolls out, create sort of like a trigger for yourself to see if we even get above 70%, to see if it's working?
So I think what the purpose of including this information in this presentation, and as we get to sort of the later time periods, we will have a better understanding of how these factors are really telling the story about what's happening in enrollment.
Happening
And with our enrollment.
with enrollment, okay.
Right.
Okay.
And just to be frank, these are some factors that we can't necessarily control.
For sure, sure. But we're trying to do something.
Right.
And I just want to know if the something that we are going to do, and then we won't know it until 4 or 5 years later, right? But if the something that we're going to do matters to these percentages is all.
So I don't think we've outlined yet how we will evaluate on the different strategies, but I think that is definitely something I can contribute to along with Chief Jones's team over at OAA.
I mean, I would say a main takeaway from this analysis, and I really appreciate all the work Nicole's done on this, because this is the most comprehensive view that I recall ever seeing about how these outside factors are correlated to our enrollment. I mean, I think we just haven't had this kind of a glimpse before, so I'm incredibly appreciative of that. I will say the main takeaway for me is that a lot of it is pretty strongly correlated to birth rates, which we don't have total control over. So then to your point, then what is within the margins of understanding that we don't control the birth rate? What can we do to get to 72% versus 70% capture rate or 73%? What is it? Are there specific strategies that could get us to the highest capture rate possible for whatever birth rate it is that we have?
And I'll also mention, we didn't have it prepared in time enough for today's presentation, but we should for the board meeting, is an actual developing a regression model that here we infer about the relationship, about building out a regression model that includes the information about births, population, children, housing permits, unemployment rates, to really more explicitly detail what the actual impact of those different factors are on enrollment.
So, lady economist, thank you. But I guess, okay, capture rate's probably the most important factor. So we look at capture rate at 70%. Does that mean that 70% is the correlation?
So
Or-
70,
Or 70% is just the number you get by looking at birth versus K enrollment?
that's
So you
exactly.
threw out some other factors. So is there some way you could say, I guess, it's not, I'm not asking you to write a position paper or a white paper, but is there some way you can say, well, we have this in terms of data on births and K enrollment, but these exogenous factors that you
Yes.
mentioned are important in the thesis.
Yes.
Therefore, we have to look at those also. Is there
Yes.
some way you can put this in?
So yes, so that is
Okay.
our intention. We just ran out of time this week. And then I think as we move to the sort of the next set of years, we continue to look at the general trend. And so here, coming out of the recession in 2009, again, at the time when nationally birth rates were at the highest, now we're in a period where births saw the largest decline in 30 years after the recession. And so you can see that births decreasing at large numbers, and then kindergarten enrollment also decreasing 6 years later. Birth rates have returned to back down to where they were prior to that increase. And then capture rates, we've discussed, they still remain relatively high during this time for reasons we probably still need to explore a little bit more. But the general trend is a decrease in births and then that decrease in kindergarten enrollment.
For kindergarten enrollment, what happened there, that 575?
So that 575 represents the, what we just explained. So in that 6 years earlier, we saw a decrease of 559 in terms of the number of births. So we saw that extreme decline in births in both 2009 and 2010.
So make sure that I'm understanding it correctly. So the table, the birth year is the 2000. So if we're looking at that particular year,
Yes.
then the birth data is from 2010, whereas the kindergarten enrollment data is from 2016, because that would be the
Yes.
cohort that was born in 2010, who then
Yes.
enrolled in 2016.
Yes.
See, I guess my point is, makes the trend look bad. SY16 is 559 versus 575. Then SY17, it's 67 versus 180.
Right. Right. And
That's a scary trend.
exactly. Yeah. Yes. And again, it just contributes to that inference that these things are related. I think that's. So we are, but I think we'll get to later sort of how that particular change then is impacting our current enrollment. But the main point here is that those things are related, and we're just emphasizing the way in which they're related in a way that we haven't looked at previously.
Well, we are getting this, just to clarify, we are getting the students. We're getting in that year you're looking at, SY17 enrollment, that was 74% of the students who were born. So the
I'm just talking at the margin.
Yeah. But of the 6,549 students who enrolled that year, that was 6,500 of the 8,800 kids who were born 5 years prior. So that's 74%. So that's actually still a pretty high capture rate compared to our historical trends. It's just that then you want to, to all your points, we need to figure out how to maximize that as much as we can.
Yes.
But I think the regression analysis that Nicole's talking about, that that looks at other factors too, would be really helpful to isolate housing, crime rates, and the correlation of those rates to the capture rate would be really helpful too.
Yes.
Because the challenge is, and we've seen this with some other initiatives this is so helpful to me because we want to be investing in the things that have the biggest return on investment, and so any analysis we can do to help really hone in on what would be most effective is really helpful.
And so, keeping with that line of question about the decrease in kindergarten, or the 575 decrease in kindergarten students, what we when we look at year-over-year change by grade, we can see directly that impact of that smaller cohort of kindergarten students who enrolled, which constituted the students who enrolled who were born in that year of decline of births in 2009 and 2010. So now they're enrolling in school year 15-16, and so we can definitely see that we begin with the smaller cohort of kindergarten students. And so then every year since then, we can see how those students have progressed through the grades over time. And so last year, there was a lot of discussion about the overall decrease in second graders. And this year, now we're seeing an overall decrease in third graders. And we can see how that is directly related to that smaller kindergarten cohort.
So I just want to make this point. I'd like to get us to a place where no matter the growth rate, we're still capturing kids. And that's all about the product, right? And so this is great, Nicole. I think this is amazing. But I'd like to know, well, what changes did the district do? Like, did we open a school that was impressive enough to attract families? So it's sort of like connecting our product to these figures as well.
Right, and that's not the intention here. The intention here is that that we understand these things and how they are related, so that they can be inputs to the subsequent questions that we have. But without this, we are sort of shooting in the dark about what's happening and what the targets are and what the real impact is, and, providing some, just some context that, just to be, again, frank, that a lot of this is driven by births, or a lot of what has happened
Right.
is driven by births and not necessarily students fleeing, families fleeing the district.
For sure.
You know, I think this is excellent. This is a quantitative study and we can see that. But what would be great at some point, and you probably don't have the staff to do that, do a qualitative study. So everything you're talking about is a qualitative study where we can look at the numbers and see what happened. And it's much more clear when you look at what actually happened with these numbers.
Absolutely.
And I think that would be so great. We can talk more about it when we see what's going on in the community and what's going on in the homes and what's going on with the children. So if we can connect the quantitative with the qualitative, that would be great. I don't know if you have time to do that, but what you just, but what
Well,
you.
I think the regression analysis that you mentioned that would consider some of the factors you're talking about, like housing, crime rate, and the
Right,
correlation
right.
of those factors is really important.
Right.
I think that from a qualitative perspective, I think we do need to, what we need to figure out, again, is what are the strategies that have been linked to, are there strategies that we could link to, once you isolate the other factors that are correlated with these various trends, are there other factors that initiatives that the district took under certain times where we had higher capture rate that we could attribute. We have tried to do, things like analysis of, school programming. It can be challenging, or creation of new schools can be challenging because something like the kindergarten entry rate, you can create a new school and you have new students coming into kindergarten, but you don't really know whether those students
Well,
were
you
going to
just-
were
you
they were
just
going to
did
just
the
go to
study.
another school or so on. We have done studies where we've looked at students enrolling in say charter schools
Right.
in higher, like throughout in grades 1, 2, 3, 4, and I don't remember the statistics off the top of my head. I don't know if you've ever seen that particular analysis we did, but that basically those students are coming from, for the most part, they're coming from other traditional schools, or they're coming from, like, they're newly enrolled to the district
Right.
at a similar or slightly lower rate
And-
than the district.
and
So it's
exactly-
not as if that's creating,
Right.
at least in the upper grades,
Right.
new enrollments. It could be that all the kids come in at kindergarten, but that's just hard to compare because you just don't know what they would have done otherwise.
And you know what? You just did it. You just did the whole study, the qualitative study. Everything you said is exactly what I'm talking about. You just made that connection, and it would be so great that everything both of you are saying, put that connection together, and it's already done. Because we know why. We know that we have the numbers, and we have all the other studies of the community or whatever, and we could just put it in writing. That would be great.
And so I think the next slide actually gets to some of what we're talking about in the kindergarten enrollment in private school. So we pulled data from the American Community Survey, which has data by grade band of the students who, or the young people who live in Baltimore City, and then what types of schools they are attending. And so the map shows the counts of students in a community statistical area who attend private school at the kindergarten level. And so what we can see is that we have a number of community statistical areas where no kindergarten students are attending private school. And then we have a higher concentration of students who are attending kindergarten students attending private school in sort of the northwest area of the city. And so that's Cross Country and Cheswold, Glen Falstaff, North Baltimore, Guilford, those neighborhoods. And then we can see in some of the areas that have higher concentrations that are in the southwest, which is Allendale and Irvington and Bella Edison in the northeast and Loch Raven. So they have high concentrations of kindergartners enrolled in private school. But those are the areas where we just have the most students overall. There's just a lot of young people who are living in those areas. And so when we look at the percentage of how many of them are in private school, it's you can see that it's sort of a lower percentage compared to the number that live in the in the area who are attending private school.
You got the survey, I just heard you say, I just want to be clear, American Community Survey?
So, yeah, so that
And they
is
do
really-
the study?
So it's not a study, it's a data product released
Oh,
by the
okay.
census every year.
Right.
So they are 5-year estimates, so they collect data over a 5-year time period
Mm-hmm.
so that they are able to publish annually information and data at a small level of geography, data that's not available in the decennial census. So every year we get an update of this information about our communities. But then the other takeaway here is that when we look at those 2 5-year time periods, in terms of the percentage of kindergarten students who are enrolled in public and private school, it's the exact same percentage. So you can see that we have more kindergarten students overall in that later period, reflecting what we just discussed about the increase in kindergarten over prior to the recession. And so we can see that the public K and the private K, the percentages of those are the same. Okay. All right, rolling along. And so one other question we wanted to answer and then emphasize, so we just looked at how that more recent smaller kindergarten cohort, how that impacted the elementary enrollment. And so now when we look at the longer trend of this period, this time period of extreme changes in births and kindergarten enrollment, we look at the kindergarten, if we look at the large cohort of kindergartners who enrolled in school year 12-13 as a result of births being up, we can see that they are now in 6th grade. And so it allows us to look at a couple of different things. One, that transition at 6th grade. And so one question that we always get is, what's happening at 6th grade? And for this particular time period, 2 things are happening. So since you started with that larger cohort, once you get to the 6th grade, it's actually representing an increase of 6th graders at that grade level. And so if you look at the change in just overall change from school year 15 to 19, you can see that at the 6th grade, we're experiencing an increase of 6th graders and then a decrease of the elementary grades. But again, that's largely tied to the different kindergarten cohorts and how they progress through the grades over time. However, what is also important, so that capture rate that we were talking about, so we looked at the kindergarten capture rate, now that we look at the 6th grade capture rate, it is a decrease in capture rate. However, even though we're losing students, it hasn't impacted our overall 6th grade total enrollment because of that larger kindergarten cohort. I can't quite see.
Go back to page 10. I'm looking at SY. I'm just looking at kindergarten.
Okay.
SY 15 through SY 19. That's not pretty, right?
And it represents a change from what our peak kindergarten enrollment was.
Right.
Right, because of, again, I'm sounding like
Right.
I'm repeating myself,
Right.
but we had that large cohort because of
Right.
that huge increase in births.
Right.
And so when we get out to school year 19, we can see the increase of that decrease in births and how that's impacting what's happened in between those years.
So if you take that out 5 years from 2019,
We'll get
those
there.
charts are going to look pretty bloody, I think.
We'll get there, and
Okay.
I'm being
I'm sorry.
cognizant of my time, so
Okay.
I wanted to make sure that we presented this information, but I will try to move a little bit more quickly through the presentation. So again, the second question we have, so we said that the number of 6th graders hasn't really changed, but when we do look at exits, it is important to understand sort of where the students who are enrolled at 5th grade, the ones who then make different decisions about attending city schools at 6th grade. And so, as I mentioned before, we do have a decreasing grade progression ratio at the 6th grade. And this map represents more so the counts of exits at sixth grade across the city. And so you can see that, again, the areas in the Southwest that have a large number of students overall, you can see that they are the ones that are experiencing high levels of decreases of also sixth graders. And we can also see that the number of sixth graders who are attending public versus private school, many of them are exiting to other public school systems in Maryland.
So and this is the sixth grade progression ratio. Have you looked at kind of for different cohorts over time from K through, I don't know, through 9 or whatever, the, you know, I mean, as you can see in all these cohorts, it does generally go down. Have you looked at whether that, the degree to which is decreasing has changed, not just in sixth grade, but across the grades?
Yes, so we look at grade progression ratios as an input to our enrollment, our 10-year enrollment projections every year. And sixth grade is one that sticks out as one that does have a sort of a rapidly decreasing trend in comparison. And then we didn't include in this presentation, but we will have in the CEFMP at ninth grade, we always have a grade progression ratio above 100%. And that's because we have some repeaters who repeat ninth grade, but then also we have quite a few students who come back to the district at ninth grade. And so that's how those grade progression ratios then play into what we do for our enrollment projections.
So, but have you generally looked, other than outside those grades, whether the progression over grades has decreased over time? You know,
Not specifically at every grade level, to make a summary about them at this time.
okay.
All right, and so then what else we wanted, the other thing we wanted to, explore about sixth grade exits. So we did a percent total. So before we were looking at counts, and now we're looking at percentages. And so as an example, Dickeyville, which is the darker shaded community statistical area, they had 36 fifth graders who were rising sixth graders, and 13 of them left the district, and that represented a really high percentage for that community. But then when you look at Bella Edison, they had 234 fifth graders, and 15 of them left the district. So this is just examining sort of the geography of how students are moving, and then trying to contribute to some of the discussion about what happens at sixth grade, and then also giving that context of it's different across different communities, and probably different than what we might expect in terms of where those exits are happening. And so when we cross this with the Community Conditions Index, we look overall, there were about 6,200 rising sixth graders, and then we look at them based on the categories of the Community Conditions Index. We can see that the range is between 11 to 14%, but you essentially have the same rates of students living in those different types of neighborhoods who are exiting at sixth grade. And so 11% at low investment, and then about 14% in the higher investment areas. And then when we compare exits to entrance, we can see that those percentages are about even across all the different communities in the city, I think, which may be a little different than we have previously assumed happens with students who leave the district.
Dr. Stewart, can we kind of move it a little bit along?
Yes, absolutely.
Sorry.
Nope, that's okay. All right. So to the earlier point about enrollment projections, and so we talked about how enrollment and births have played into sort of the pre and post recession, and now we're looking at how it's going to impact enrollment in the future. And so like we saw that huge decline in births in 2009 and 2010, we just also saw a decrease in 2017. So that 2017 birth decline is going to impact the kindergarten enrollment of our incoming school year 22-23 class. And so that's important for us to think about. And then that also gets included into our enrollment projections. And so our, as I mentioned, our enrollment projections indicate that in in school year 22-23, we will see a decline in kindergarten enrollments based on that birth decline. And so that is included in how we come up with the kindergarten cohort for the upcoming years. So then we get to what the overall projections look like. And so it's just important for us to remember that projections are not promises. And we are looking at basically the enrollment trends over time, the grade progression ratios over time, and based on those factors, based on those factors, we are projecting a decrease, but we did make some adjustments so that the trend is more reflective of what's happening. But we are projecting that we will end up at about 71,000 enrollment 10 years out. But again, many of these factors will be changing over time, so it's just an estimation right now. So utilization targets, really quickly. As a part of our MOU, we have a 86% target for utilization for school year 19-20. And so the board has made a number of changes to the portfolio. And so if we just dig in a little bit there about what those changes have looked like over the last year, we decreased the portfolio by 5,000 seats. So when we're closing Lake Clifton, Dr. Roland Patterson, Harriet Tubman becomes a swing building in Gilmore. So that reduction in 5,000 seats and the estimation of students enrolled in programs that are in our building, we actually meet our 87% target for the requirement for our MOU based on those factors. That's what we're estimating. Enrollment in housing, I'll just talk about this briefly. So there have been questions in previous board meetings about how planning looks at housing. And so we're just demonstrating here that every year as a part of the CEFMP, we analyze permit information to look at where housing developments are that are under construction or have been approved. And then we use our student yield calculator to estimate the number of students that might be derived from those housing units. So as an example, in East Baltimore, the projects, the 4 projects included there result in equal out to be 275 housing units. And then our student yield estimates about 75 students would result from those housing units. And so we look at this information every year, and it then gets included in some of our discussions around portfolio, so that where we need to understand the relationship between things that are coming online and how that might impact schools. All right, really briefly, just in 2029, Baltimore City's Housing and Community Development, they released this community development framework with a number of different strategies, and then how that framework gets implemented is through the neighborhood sub-cabinet. And so facilities planning has been participating in these discussions. There are a number of subgroups that are part of neighborhood cabinet that address different geographic areas or the different focuses. So middle neighborhoods, impact neighborhoods, green network. And so we've essentially been, so it's coordinated by the mayor's office, and we've been participating in those discussions. One of the initial things we're doing is identifying sort of the intersection between sort of those major initiatives that are outlined in the framework and city schools plans. So this is an example of the different impact areas that the city is focused on. And then we know we have 21 schools within those impact areas, which include 2 21st century schools, Arlington and Pimlico. We've also been participating in the middle neighborhoods discussion, and so that's a focus on the neighborhoods that are considered middle neighborhoods based on the new housing market typology. And so we've been involved in those discussions, providing context and for some of the school trends. And we can see that middle neighborhoods cover a large portion of Baltimore City, about 63 of our school zones. And so we are continuing those discussions. Part of the the outcome of those meetings is to develop policies and pilots that will impact middle neighborhoods. And there's a discussion about how schools are included in those discussions. And we're also involved in the school-centered neighborhood investment initiatives. I won't get into this, but we are doing, as I mentioned before, 21st century profiles, so doing some mapping and some data analysis, just trying to understand where students are coming from and where they're going over time in the new 21st century buildings. And then, as I mentioned, we're continuing to expand our data visualization and story maps, one of which, the first one we're doing, is focused on the portfolio and understanding, yes, we close buildings, but then we also have open schools, and then we have charter programs, and then also opening 21st century buildings that are opening across the district. So again, providing that context for some of our partners and external folks to understand what's happening across the district with our portfolio. And we'll be using those story maps to tell other stories about city schools. And we'll do some other things in the CEFMP, some other data analysis that might be of interest. And we will be submitting the CEFMP July 1st. And that is all. All right.
Dr. Stewart, you did good.
All right.
Thank you so much. Any short questions, quick questions from the commissioners?
I'd like to get some one-on-one time with you, Dr. Stewart, just to go over the middle neighborhoods work that you guys are doing, if that's okay, for us to sit down together.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, thanks.
Really great
Next.
analysis, Nicole, thank you.
Next, procurement. Are you there here, right? Procurement. Is procurement here? Yes. Okay, thank you.
Forgive me, I've never done this, but first up is Cloverland.
You know your mic.
What's that?
Turn your mic on.
Introduce yourself
Peter
and
Rushton.
welcome.
Thank you. I'm here for Joe Vogel.
Your name is Peter.
Rutschkin,
Rushkin.
Ruchkin.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Cloverland Farms Dairy is the first letter. Sure.
There you're live.
Okay. You hear me?
We're ready.
Chief Financial Officer requests the board's approval to piggyback Anne Arundel County Public Schools competitively bid requirements contract 17 CM 273 with Cloverland Farms Dairy to provide and deliver pasteurized milk, dairy products, and juices to city
Why don't-
schools cafeterias.
Why don't we just pause for a minute? Do you have any, should we see if board members have questions about any of them, or do you want them each presented?
You know what, the board members have, our board members have actually read
Okay.
all of the procurement, and and it's actually advertised on, I mean, it's not advertised, but it is televised, so any of our community members who would like to respond and send us email or whatever, you really don't have to go through it, but does any of the commissioners have any questions or comments in reference to the procurement items?
My comment with all of these is, it is my assumption that they are inside of the FY20 budget, and we have approved the funding already.
That is
That is correct? Okay.
For the Cloverland, yes.
For the Cloverland, okay.
So as part of the procurement process, the department has to identify what the funding source is for the item.
And also, because it's your first time here, I guess, what we usually do is have you read each one of them. We have already read them, and
Great.
usually we have a question. Sometimes we have a question of concern, and sometimes the answer might come back through our director of our board, and we get it later. Unless the board has questions related to some of the procurement items, Commissioner Reed?
I'm fine.
We're fine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for pitching in.
One, for those who are listening and those who are here, our next board meeting is on, our next operations meeting is on June 18th, 2019, and is in reference to 21st Century Schools update. So you're welcome to come and listen to the presentation. And anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Oh, that was good.
That was.
You